to my channel. I'm Nonna, and we're here tonight for another rendition of Storytime with Nonna. Nonna in Italian means grandma, and that's what my grandkids call me, so you can call me Nonna too. I love that. Tonight we're reading a very exciting book, a very special book. I've enjoyed reading this to my children and grandchildren for years, and it's called The Adventures of Curious George, written and illustrated by Margaret and H.A. Ray. Wonderful team. They did a wonderful job with this book. This book is a collection of stories about a little monkey called Curious George. You may have heard of George. So tonight we're going to be reading Curious George Takes a Job. This is George. He lived in the zoo. He was a good little monkey and always very curious. He wanted to find out what was going on outside the zoo. One day, when the keeper was not paying attention, George got hold of the key for the cage. Oh, you see him right there? He's curious and he's a little bit naughty. When the keeper discovered what had happened, it was too late. George was gone. He's fast. Where was George? All the keepers, they looked for him everywhere. They looked in the rhinoceros house, the seal pool, the elephant house, there's a hippo. Couldn't find him anywhere. Somebody's even looking in the trash can. Wow. Nowhere to be found. Uh-oh. There he is. George was hiding in the hay of his friend, the elephant. Finally, the keepers gave up looking for him. George found a nice cozy spot under the elephant's right ear, and the next morning before the zoo opened, he got away safely. That was nice of the elephant to help him spend the night. Once in the street, George felt a little scared. What should he do in the big city? Maybe he could find his friend, the man with the yellow hat who had brought him over from Africa a long time ago. Only George did not know where he lived. There was a bus stopping in the corner. George had never ridden one. Quickly, he climbed a lamppost and jumped onto the bus, and off they went. Wow, he's pretty good if he can stay on that bus. He doesn't have anything to hold on to, but he's pretty agile. Wow, this is a big city, isn't it? Look at all those cars. Now they were right in the center of town. There was so much to see that George did not know where to look first. If only he could go on riding like this forever. He's having a grand old time up there. But after a while, George got tired and a little dizzy. When the bus slowed down to turn into a side street, George jumped off. There was a restaurant right in front of him. I bet he smelled some good smells there. Something smelled good. George felt very hungry. The kitchen door stood open and George walked in. On the table was a big pot. Of course, George was curious. He had to find out what was in it. When the cook came back, he had a big surprise. Spaghetti was all over the place. And in the middle of it was a little monkey. Oh boy. George had been eating yards and yards and yards and had wound himself up in all that spaghetti. Look at him. He's having a ball. The cook was a kind man and did not scold much. Well, that was good. But George had to clean up the kitchen and then do all the dishes. That's fair. My, what a lot of them there were. The cook was watching George. You are lucky to have 4 hands, he said. You can do things twice as quickly. Because George can use his feet like hands. I have a friend who could use a handy little fellow like you to wash windows. If you would like to, I can take you over to him. So they went down into the subway and took an uptown train to the cook's friend, who was an elevator man in a skyscraper. I've been on the subway. Have you been on a subway before? It was pretty fun. Sure, I can use you, the elevator man said to George. I will give you what you need to do the job. You can start right away, but remember, you are here for washing windows. Never mind what people inside the house are doing. Don't be curious. or you'll get into trouble. Oh, I hope George will listen to this man. George promised to be good, but little monkeys sometimes forget. George has his hat and his window washing wand and soap and water. And look at all the windows that he's got to wash in that building. My goodness. George was ready to start. My, how many windows there were. But George got ahead quickly. He worked with all four hands. He jumped from window to window, just as he had once jumped from tree to tree in the African jungle. For a while, George stuck to his work and did not pay any attention to the people inside. Of course, he was curious, but he remembered his promise. Good boy, George. In one room, there was a little boy who was crying because he did not want to eat his spinach. George did not even look, but went right on with his work. In another room, a man was taking a nap and snoring. George was sorry it was not his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He listened to the funny noise for a while and then went on working. But what was going on in here? George stopped working and pressed his nose against the window. Two painters were working inside. George was fascinated. Painting looked like a lot more fun than window washing. Uh-oh, I think George is getting curious again. The painters were getting ready to go out for lunch. The minute they left, George climbed inside. What wonderful paints and brushes they had. George could not resist. Art is fun with George, too. An hour later, the painters came back. They opened the door and stood there with their mouths wide open. The whole room had changed into a jungle with palm trees all over the walls and a giraffe and two leopards and a zebra. And a little monkey was busy painting himself on one of the trees. There he's painting himself right there. Then the painters knew what had happened. Uh-oh. I think it looks pretty good, but I don't know if the person that lived there would like it. Luckily, George was close to a door. He ran out as fast as he could. After him ran the two painters, then the elevator man, then the woman who lived in the place. "Oh, my lovely room," cried the woman. "Don't let him get away!" George headed for the fire escape. George reached the end of the fire escape. The others had not caught up with him yet, but George could easily jump down and escape. In a moment, he would be safe. Poor little George. He had forgotten that the pavement was as hard as stone, not like the soft grass of the jungle. Oh no, look at George's foot. He jumped onto the hard pavement and hurt his foot. Too bad. The fall had broke his leg, and an ambulance came to take George to the hospital. "He got what he deserved," said the woman, "making my apartment into a jungle indeed." "I told him he would get into trouble," said the elevator man. He was too curious. George had to lie in bed with his leg high up in a plaster cast. He was very unhappy. Well, that doesn't look like fun, does it? Poor George. And it had all started so nicely. If only he had not been so curious, he could have had a lot of fun. Now it was too late. But the next morning, George's friend, the man with the yellow hat, was buying his newspaper. Suddenly, he got very excited. "This is George!" he shouted when he saw the picture on the front page. Quickly, he read the whole story and then ran to a telephone booth to ring the hospital. "I am George's friend," he said to the nurse who answered the telephone. "Please take good care of him so that he will be getting better quickly. I want to take him to a movie studio and maybe make a picture about his life in the jungle. Don't let him get into any more mischief until I can take him away." Wow, George is going to be in a movie. Finally, the day came when George could walk again. "Your friend is going to take you away this morning," said the nurse. "Just wait right here for him and don't touch anything." Uh-oh. I wonder if George will remember not to touch anything. As soon as George was alone, he looked around at all the strange hospital things. "I wonder what's in that big blue bottle," he thought. "Don't do it, George." George was very curious. It smelled funny. Suddenly, his head began to spin. Then he felt as if he were flying. Then Rings and stars danced before his eyes. Then everything went dark. That's because that says ether, and that's supposed to put you to sleep when you go to an operation. And this was how the man with the yellow hat found George when he came to call for him. They picked him up and shook him, but they could not wake him up. He was so fast asleep that finally they put him under the shower. How surprised he was when he woke up. Wow. George said goodbye to the nurse and the kind doctor. Then he and the man with the yellow hat got into the car to drive to the movie studio. In the president's office, George got to sign a contract. He was a movie actor now. Wow, he's going to be famous. In the studio, George was kept so busy all the time that he forgot to be curious. He liked the jungle that they made for him and played happily there. There's the camera and the lights. They're going to tell his life story. How exciting. And when the picture was finally finished, George invited all of his friends to see it. The doctor and the nurse and the ambulance driver and the man from the newsstand and the woman and the elevator man and the two painters and the cook and the reporter and all the keepers at the zoo. Now playing Curious George. Wow. And I think even the lady that was mad at him is going to enjoy his movie. There she is. She looks happy now. Now the lights went out and the picture started. This is George, the voice began. He lived in the jungle. He was a good little monkey. He had only one fault. He was very curious. The end. Did you like that story? I thought that was a really good one. I'm glad everything turned out well for George. Thanks so much for watching. This has been Storytime with Nonna. We'll see you next time. Bye!